moving from a fixing mindset to a healing mindset and a reconnection has totally changed the way also that I approach the injustices and the hurts of the world around me, as well as my own.
Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. I'm talking with Lyndsey Medford today about her new book, My Body and Other Crumbling Empires. It's funny, I've had that book lying around my house and a couple people have walked through and said, ooh, I really like that title. And I think you'll be interested in what it means, My Body and Other Crumbling Empires. But I'll tell you this, it is a book about healing, both physical and social healing. And what was really cool to me about this conversation is that in talking about healing, we ended up talking about slowing down. And we ended up talking about technology and how we use our phones and about paying attention. And we also talked about food banks and capitalism and all of these different ideas which might seem unrelated, but are really related to the topic of healing. So I think you'll enjoy the ways in which this conversation goes in directions that might be unexpected and yet also feel really linked to what it means to pay attention to who we are and to our world in a way that brings healing. One note I should mention, for about the first half of the interview, you will hear some birds in the background. And I'm just going to say I hope that they help you welcome the signs of spring and that they are not a big distraction. So here is my conversation with Lyndsey Medford. Well, I'm here today with Lyndsey Medford. Lyndsey is the author of a new book, My Body and Other Crumbling Empires, Lessons for Healing in a World That Is Sick. Lyndsey, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And tell us where you are coming from. I don't know if listeners are going to be able to hear the birds chirping in the background, but for anyone who's like me in Connecticut, there might not be open doors or windows and birds chirping in the background. So tell us where you're coming from.
I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we just moved here. That was a particularly loud bird. So it's just gotten warm enough to leave the doors open. So, of course, we're doing that at all times.
Well, enjoy it. We will get there, those of us in the Northeast, eventually.
Yes.
All right, shifting gears to your book. I was trying to think of a way to just, kind of introduce people to your story, which you tell in a really comprehensive, I think, and compelling way throughout the course of the book. But towards the end of the book, you have a line where you say that for years you have either been told or said about yourself that your body is a prophet. And you also say, but the meaning you have behind those words has changed over the years. So I thought maybe that would be a way to introduce your story, to reflect on that concept of your body as a prophet and the way your own thinking about that has changed over the years.
Yeah, that's a really fun way to start. The most clear and obvious, and even the most, when you think of a biblical prophet, maybe the most clear parallel is that when I started to listen to what my body needed after I got sick, and also after I spent about a year just kind of waiting for pharmaceuticals to fix me, and they kind of just made things worse. As I started to pay attention to my actual life and to what made my body feel better or worse, it was things like, it was disconnection. Disconnection from the source of my food, disconnection from my body itself. There was a huge shift once I switched off of hormonal birth control, from treating my body as this thing to be controlled, to trying something different as far as that went. Even I feel a lot better when I feel connected with my family and friends, and there's a lot of scientific and biological reasons for that. And so the more I dug into the many aspects of my life that were contributing to my body's overload and my original chronic illness, the more I was finding my body speaking about what is not right in this world, ultimately. Because those were my personal choices, but they were also things that we are, those are the normal things to do. These aspects of disconnection that I was experiencing. And so not only was my body ultimately telling me about my life, but also about the world that I lived in. And so that was the first way that I experienced my body as a prophet. And that was the way I started writing the book, was like, look at these things that are making us sick. And isn't this an outrage? Which it is. But I also, as I have continued to learn how to live with autoimmune disease, and as I have spent more and more time and made more and more relationships in different social justice and activism spaces, I have found my body also telling me not just about what needs to change, but about how we go about making that change. And specifically, that we are conditioned to try and fix things, especially, I would say, white, middle, or higher class people are really conditioned to like set goals and go after them and form a committee and make a project management board and set a deadline and fix a problem. Yeah. And when we find out or encounter injustice, our immediate, all we kind of have to bring to the situation sometimes is that attitude of like, well, let's get to it, and hopefully we'll be done here in a year or two. Right. And that fixing attitude did not work for my body, as I said before, and it doesn't work. We're trying so hard to be effective, but it's really ineffective at countering the forces of empire that we are trying to subvert here. And so moving from a fixing mindset to a healing mindset and a reconnection has totally changed the way also that I approach the injustices and the hurts of the world around me, as well as my own.
Can you say a little bit more about both of those in terms of the shift from fixing to healing and what that actually looked like in your experience?
Of course, yeah. I mean, and this is also something that I have learned from other people. Of course, I think a lot of people have their own stories of this. Anybody that has healed from any sort of mental illness or trauma, I think, has been through this same thing where you show up and often we also like to sort of outsource this, like the medical industry and other things have conditioned us to be like, excuse me, I'm broken and your job is to fix me. Right. And then we show up and actually it's our job to participate, even if obviously most of us need some sort of professional help to achieve our goals, but it's our job to participate. And that healing process is really long, and that healing process is often painful and ugly. We like healing is just this beautiful word, and it's in the practice. It's just rarely the beauty comes in these like incredibly surprising moments out of like a lot of muck and confusion, often, usually, in my experience. Yeah. And so there's just so much more to it. So that's on a personal level. And then on a wider societal scale, we have learned really specific, again, like these very specific tools and very specific avenues. Like often if there's a problem, we're like, okay, so who is writing the legislation that's going to make this go away? And like, how do we design a campaign over the next 1 year to make that legislation fix the thing. Which that's a fantastic tool that we need. And it's not an effective tool if we are not learning about and then working towards changing the underlying issues for a lot of these things. If we talk about climate change, if we talk about systemic racism, if we talk about ableism, these are all things that you can and we should pass legislation about, do a training at work about, whatever sort of low-hanging fruit tools we immediately reach for. But then there is also so much underlying, in the same way that autoimmune disease is very hard to describe. It's very hard to understand. It's not always, it's rarely very simple to just be like, well, here's the problem, and this molecule or this surgery can fix it. It's a ecosystem. The body is an ecosystem, and the autoimmune disease is a really good example of how different pieces and parts interact. Even the mind, the body, and the soul. Yeah. And the wider social, our neighborhoods and our social interactions all contribute to this thing in ways that are just really hard to measure and define, but clearly there. We have the same, we also struggle to grasp and to stay with the complexity of some of these other issues that I just described on that wider level. But there are so many pieces to pay attention to, and so many levels to pay attention to. So if we have legislation and it's making better rules for disabled people, we also have a cultural piece that someone needs to be responsible for in helping each other understand what those rules are for and who they're for and why they're good for everyone. And then we have maybe an economic piece where we need to, even if the rules make a building more accessible, is poverty kind of undercutting that because most disabled people live in poverty. We have an interpersonal piece where we've been taught just inappropriate things about disabilities and disabled people. And accessibility also means that we're unlearning the ableism within ourselves. And so, to me, all of that is what healing is, because healing is when we're reconnecting these things that have been disconnected and broken, because disconnection ultimately is profitable to empire. When we feel that we're alone, when we feel that everything is too much for us to understand and someone else is going to have to come in and fix it for us, that's when we go along with the way things are, the status quo. And intentional or not, it's really profitable for us, for others, for us to stay that way.
Yeah, it's so interesting, that kind of passive posture of, well, it's interesting because it's like there are two options within a certain framework, right? There's either the passive, I can't do anything and I just need a doctor or the system to fix me. Then there's also the only answer is an action, right? Like a decisive action right now. And what you're describing is something actually that is neither of those, in the sense that it's like participatory. So there is some measure of activity and passivity when we are participating, and it's holistic and it's long. Like it just is, and that tends to feel slow to us. I'm not sure that it is slow, but it is within our current world and ecosystem, which is so fast paced and immediate. that sense of the time that it takes, whether that's to heal a body, to heal a relationship, to heal a culture, is going to, I think, feel slow to us. And that kind of leads me to asking, and I know, again, there's a mapping that you do throughout the book where you've got your personal story within your body, as well as this wider story, both of COVID and the pandemic, but even, again, beyond that, of various just social ills, whether that's the epidemics of chronic illness or of racism and injustices. So we've got all of that going on. This is honing back in on you and your particular illness, although, again, I recognize this is always kind of in conversation with these other themes. And you wrote, my autoimmune disease may have been a genetic fluke, but it was also a classic case of burnout. And I wanted to ask you to explain what you mean by that, like just for, listeners who haven't read your book and don't know those details. But then I also just want to talk about that relationship between connecting illness or pain to exhaustion and stress without blaming, shaming, kind of guilt, putting yourself in this position of like, it's all my fault. So we can get back to that part of the question. So can you start with just explaining what does it mean to have a genetic fluke that also is a classic case of burnout? And what did that look like in your life?
Oh, yeah. Well, to be very specific, many different chronic illnesses and particularly autoimmune illnesses you can have the gene for it. And I'm not a geneticist. I don't know exactly what this means, but the gene does not switch on until your body reaches a certain point of overload. A lot of people develop these after having a virus, which may be part of what's contributing to the long COVID issues, where the virus really overwhelms their system. Tons of people develop autoimmune problems after this, any physical or emotional or spiritual trauma in their lives. And so I actually did not have a trauma or a virus, and I think this does answer the second part of your question. I was just living my normal 26-year-old life, which meant I went to grad school and I had a full course load, and I was terrified of loans and too proud to even consider them. So the point being, I had a full course load and a part-time job catering on my feet in the middle of the night to pay my bills.
Yeah.
And then after that, after I graduated, the year I got sick in particular, I was applying to PhD programs, working full time. I got married. I moved across the country. I got to a place where we didn't know anybody at all. In fact, a place I'd never been until we came there in the moving truck.
Oh
and then we got a puppy. And then all of a sudden I was sick. And I wouldn't even say that I felt burnt out. I was just doing what you do.
Right.
And it turns out that was too much without a lot of other supports in place that I had never really considered myself to need.
Yeah.
And eventually it took me so long to disengage from this really intense attitude of overloading myself on every level. Super perfectionist, super ambitious in my own way. And it took me so long of being sick to finally admit that I just could not live that way.
Yeah.
No matter how much I might want to or think I was supposed to. To where, it's 6-7 years later, and I can look back at that and be like, no one should be expected to just handle all of that, and no one should be surprised if it's too much for their body. just to be constantly moving and under those emotional stresses as well. But at the time, it just felt so normal. And so from so many angles, for like that perfectionist angle and this sort of middle class, white, suburban capitalist idea of what my life and my career were supposed to look like. And also, like, not incidentally from a church angle of what I sort of like owed the world, or the ways, like, how much is enough serving and giving, especially as a woman. All of these things had me continually overloading my schedule and my life. So I think when we talk about burnout, I've almost started to shy away from talking about burnout because it does start to have this connotation of like an individual problem, or probably if you do enough yoga, then you can forestall it indefinitely. When there's this, I think burnout is actually usually a symptom of that same disconnection, where the world around us teaches us to be so busy, to be so ambitious and so self-reliant, that we are trying to do all of this without the supports that our bodies and our souls as humans are designed to need.
I'm thinking about two aspects of what you said. One, that even like that framing of guilt over the fact that the reason I'm sick is because I was exhausted, right? Like that framing is an indication in and of itself of the problem, right? Like,
yeah, it is.
And yet it is also one that I have certainly seen in myself. And I feel it when, like, I have friends who are experiencing sciatica or who have gotten sick for the third time just because there's been like a series of different illnesses. Or, I mean, I can, we can you've named long COVID. We can talk about all sorts of conditions, diseases, etc., where one seemingly compassionate narrative can be, well, you did X, Y, and Z, and that hurt your body. And again, there can be some wisdom in saying, what would it mean for me to slow down and to get the support I need? But even the way that we frame it sometimes is, well, if only you got your act together, then you wouldn't be so sick, right?
Yes.
And so I really appreciated you spent, I think, a lot of the book wrestling in that place of like, could it really be God's calling on my life for me to lie here? Like, is that even possible? That resting could be God's call on my life? I'm supposed to go change the world, aren't I? And I just appreciated that. And I wonder, having come through these years of really rebalancing and reconnecting, and you now are at a place, it sounds like, where if X, Y, and Z happens, I'm going to get sick. And so I both have there's again, some passive, this is just true of me in a way that it might not be for the next person. And there's an active, and so do I really believe enough in the integrity of who I am and the value that I have as a human to take care of myself and to do what needs to be done for that to happen. And again, you're in a position of agency, as I am, to be able to make those choices. Yeah. And that's a whole other question. But yeah, I just wondered if you could speak to that reframing in terms of how to not see your disease as your fault, and yet also to see the agency that you have in caring for yourself as like a preventative measure.
Sure. Yeah, I think I especially always have this tension at the front of my mind because so many of my friends are parents and I'm not a parent yet. And so just in that way, even apart from any other social location issues, I have a lot of autonomy over my time and my energy that other people don't. And so, yeah, I think we're all moving often through different like ratios of agency and not more of the acceptance side, or the like major asking for help side, at least. But yeah, I think this is really important. Two things to keep together when often our default is to separate them for some reason. And I think we get into conversations where you have to choose one or the other. Mm-hmm. Or if you say, I think I've been really conscious of the way that the like wellness culture puts things on people to mm-hmm. where I am sometimes hesitant to say, well, then I did this and I felt better.
Yes.
Just because then to some people that implies it's your fault.
Yeah.
If you don't get better, it's your fault, which is a horrible, mm-hmm. horrible way to feel or thing to say, which we do say to people. And I think in so many situations, we are having to process both of these at the same time.
Yeah.
I think of any situation where something can be not your fault, either your family passed this habit down to you, or the world around you traumatized you in some way, or any number of other reasons that something can be not our fault, but still our responsibility.
Yeah.
And ultimately also our responsibility to forgive ourselves. And I really appreciate you asking this question, because I really resist having to make it one or the other.
Yeah.
And then the other, it also doesn't serve us well to force ourselves or each other to pick a side, because I think we are often moving through different seasons where we have more or less agency or forces outside our control acting upon us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, being able to hold both of those together and to let them be what they are feels like a really important skill for continuing to navigate through whatever comes next when things are unpredictable, as they super are when you have a chronic illness.
Well, and I'm thinking about, I feel like we've got kind of this medical model of a fix coming in from the outside, and it works or it doesn't, but that's what you've got. You've got medication or surgery. Mm-hmm. Or a self-help model, which is you've got, particular diets or yoga practices or mindfulness and meditation or whatever. And can be some truth in both of those. Like, it's not as though I think you in any way are saying be dismissive of any of those things. And yet there's a third way that is actually, first of all, much bigger than the self, because so much of what you write about is the ways in which we need to be not just connecting within ourselves, mind, body, spirit, but actually within our communities. But there's also just a cultural norm of pushing and striving that essentially for your health, and I think this is true beyond people who actually have autoimmune diseases, right? There's a need for us to become a healthier society. That pushing and striving would also need to be really challenged. And I was, this was another place, you had two quotations that I underlined. So one was, we're taught from our early years on that we should fear self-indulgence more than self-destruction. I mean, I literally was like, oh my gosh, that articulates my early life, like teenager years in particular, that I feared self-indulgence And I essentially did not fear self-destruction because that's what I was doing to myself. And then this is, I think, a similar thought, which is in a different chapter, but you wrote, I needed my stress to prove that I was doing the best I could. And so I just wanted to explore that a little bit, that idea of like stress serving a need and self-destruction serving a need to prove ourselves in our culture. And again, like how were you able to rethink or undo some of that, some of those messages?
Yeah, I think maybe this was part of my forgiving myself. Maybe was to be like, well, there was some reason I kept doing that, and there was some reason I thought that was normal or good, and some reason it was so hard to let go of, like, this running on adrenaline. Like, it did not feel good objectively. I just didn't know another way, you know? And, you know, not to be too, it's like, it's just capitalism. And I think specifically in my, like I mentioned, my like upper middle class white suburban context, we have this need culturally in that context to justify why we deserve what we have. And so people, we do, like, we put these expectations on our like 12 and 13-year-old children on up of overachieving, of learning these skills, of managing projects and having committees, of going to the right college. And even though I wasn't, you know, I wasn't on Wall Street doing finance, I had gone to Christian college and learned, like you said, that I was supposed to be changing the world. And so I was applying that same, like, overambitious, overworking ethos to my own belief that social justice meant, frankly, burning yourself out on behalf of, like, these vague ideals often. Or that social justice meant that because other people lived in poverty and had no choice but to be burned out by their circumstances, that, you know, I couldn't rest until everyone else could, which is simply not realistic. Yeah. But for some reason, like, my religious culture didn't deal much in that realism, right? Anyway, so for me, that was where what needs those things were serving. Yeah. I think that, like, cultural piece of what our culture needs in order to maintain injustices that we know aren't right, but that we, like, don't want to have to deal with out in the suburbs, in their, like, cushy school districts and everything. I think we could go a lot deeper with that, but what was the second part of the question? Well, because I almost started there.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, in what ways was the stress serving you, but also how have you been able to rethink that so that you're not just perpetually going back to that place, like kind of getting back on the treadmill or going back to the place of overwork and thinking in those terms?
Well, that's the really important part to me, actually, is once I started to realize where this was coming from, and, like, how much more of this was about sort of ultimately about, like, maybe justifying myself or proving to God or, like, the whole entire world that I was doing enough. And being able to see where the roots of that were in capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and ableism, then I could say, okay, well, if I want to live in a world or help to build a world that I may never see without capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy, then like those patterns are just not available to me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Those things are off the table. They seem like I think I said this before, but like overworking and blasting really hard towards a goal can feel like it's efficient and effective, but it often leads us to solutions that are kind of patchwork and easily undone because they don't have that support around them of all the other dimensions of healing that are necessary. And so when I realized like burnout is built into all the things that I was trying to struggle against, using things up and using people up is sort of the ultimate goal of colonialism and capitalism. We're not just burning each other out, we're burning the planet out.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, wow, maybe one of the most urgent things we can do is actually to rediscover slowness.
Right.
Maybe one of the most like truly radical things I can do as a privileged person is to learn to sit and wait and listen long enough to see where there are resources and beautiful things to be found where I've been trained to only see, desolation and emptiness. Maybe if I don't want to live in a world where we blame people for their problems, whether it's from a personal scale to the wider scale where we excuse our policies by saying that disabled people shouldn't be disabled or poor people shouldn't be poor.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to live in a world where we don't do that, I really have to start by not doing that to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have to think about what it looks like to live a life that sends a different message to everyone around me as well.
Well, and that kind of brings me to, like, we've talked a lot about illness and, the ways in which we are breaking our bodies and our culture and destroying things. But you also do a really wonderful job, I think, in your book of insisting that our bodies don't simply offer messages of pain and illness, but about learning to be attentive. This is a list you have in there, to joy, laughter, liberation, and peace. So I'd love to hear you speak about that. What does it mean not simply to pay attention when our bodies signal dis-ease, but also to learn how to pay attention to when our bodies signal that, there's joy and peace and liberation available?
Yeah, I do think that is actually, it's one of those things that people say is really hard, and you're like, are we just making that up because it sounds nice or whatever? I think it is really hard to pay attention to our body's messages of joy and liberation and peace.
Mm-hmm.
I think as much as we are taught to dismiss our pain and assume that we're just like, our bodies are just being quirky or whatever and not actually trying to tell us a real message, we feel that much more that way about the times when we are just like, this is nice, or I feel like myself, or I feel connected to this person around me in a way that makes me really feel at home, or I am so glad that I worked through that hard thing to get to where I am now with this community or my family, or with myself, or with God. These are visceral feelings often. Contentment. Even, to bring it to like a really basic example, we struggle so much to both to heed our hunger and to understand our feelings of satisfaction and our not just feelings of satisfaction, but even to taste what tastes good to us. And that continues to translate even more into these sort of more amorphous feelings of moving from out of fight or flight, for instance, or of feeling connected. There's a lot of science I don't fully understand in the field of interpersonal neurobiology that talks about how we really truly need each other to do what we're supposed to be doing as human beings, physically and in society. But then we realize it's been 3 weeks since we had much of a real conversation with anybody, because it's this world is not built for that. But it's so hard to be I'm lonely, and so much harder to be I had a wonderful evening with a friend on my front porch. Mm-hmm. And that says something to me about how the world needs to be, and about what my priority, what is a legitimate priority in my life.
Mm. Well, there is a sense
I don't know that.
I'm just thinking about that. What you were saying about slowness and the way in which slowness can allow us to pay attention. That, I mean, one of even just literally, if you are watching something that's moving really quickly, it is harder to pay attention to the details because it's just moving too quickly. And I think that's true about our lives as well. And so on the one hand, there's the paying attention on the pain side of things. But as you're also saying, the paying attention to the joy, and just, it's so sad to think about how much we might miss in the almost inability to pay attention because of moving so quickly. But one of the, I'm curious to hear from you if you've had any practices that have helped you in this. For me, and listeners might have heard me talk about this before, but the Ignatian Examen, the idea of literally reviewing the day and asking the question of when there was a moment of consolation, of joy or peace or connection, and a moment of desolation, of really feeling desolate, absent from connection with myself or with God or with others. That's been really helpful to me in exactly what you're saying, and being my cup of tea in the morning truly brings me delight. It really does. I am almost giddy about it. And I'm not sure I would have noticed that if I hadn't started paying attention. And that's a really mundane example. And yet there is also that sense of just kind of honoring what we've been given in ourselves, in our bodies, in our world, that has come from that. So yeah, I'm curious whether there are other practices that you have in your daily life of paying attention, either on the paying attention to pain or illness, or paying attention to joy and connection.
One of my nerdy side interests is learning about how technology, but smartphones and the internet in particular, sort of change our brains, change the way we think, all of this stuff. So fascinating. And I think maybe because of that research I've done over the years in particular, I pay a lot of attention to how I feel when I'm on my computer or my phone. Which is partly because the people who design these websites, that's what they do. Mm-hmm. They bring people into rooms and sit them down and track their eye movements and their breathing rates and their body language to find out how these things are making them feel. But they're also designed to kind of mask from us how we are actually feeling. They're really effective for doing a lot of things, but they're also really effective for just numbing out from the world. And so paying a lot of attention both to how I feel when I am on my phone and when I am off my phone is a ongoing thing for me that feels, I do think I have learned so much about the internet and the ways we interact just from that practice.
Well, and I'm curious, what does that actually look like? Like, how do you pay attention to that? Do you like make sure that once a day you ask yourself that question? Are you now conscious of it enough that you're actually thinking about it in the moment? Like, what is paying attention actually take? What shape does that take?
Yeah, I do. It is like a habit for me now. One thing that really has helped me do this. I don't even know if everyone won't feel helped by it because doesn't always feel good. But I learned that most people, like when we click on an email, we hold our breath because we don't know what's coming, or we're sort of hoping for a certain rush, or something, or feeling stressed. And I started noticing that with other things besides just email. And I started practicing what does it feel like to sort of breathe slowly and then open Gmail and then try to take this all in from a more centered space. It is really hard. It's just a lot to be taking in.
Yeah.
And we're holding our breath because we're overloaded by it.
Right.
And I still don't always know what to do about that at all.
Yeah.
And I still, when I'm sitting on my couch and I'm like, man, I'm really tired, I just grab my phone without thinking about it, and like, there goes 30 minutes.
Right.
So it's so hard. It's very illustrative of these things that we can be aware of and do our very best to live like counter to what other people are trying to form us as.
Right.
And then also it's gonna still be an ongoing struggle. The other thing I will also say, I think spending time in like food pantries and soup kitchens and stuff just forces you to pay attention to the good and the bad.
Yeah.
On a different level. And even some days are like, this is amazing. This is the kingdom of God. This is like everything I was ever told would be wonderful about doing justice. And then some days you're like, I don't know why I ever started this, and I don't know if I can keep going, and why do I think this is worth it at all? And when your heart is just broken, or someone that you love has either betrayed you, or anyway, those days are also days that teach me to pay attention to the good, actually.
Yeah. It makes sense to me. I remember I was at Yale Divinity School talking to students, and although they're at Divinity School, they're also on the same kind of treadmill that we're talking about in terms of overwork and proving yourself through your work. And one of the students there was like, okay, I so don't want to stay in this place, but how? Like, how do I do it? And what came to me at the time, which I think is really related to what we're talking about here, was there's an internal practice of contemplation. Like, whether that's what I was talking about with the examine, or just literally being like, I'm going to sit in the love of God. Like, that's all I'm going to do for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes. The breathing deeply that you are describing, like some sort of inner contemplative practice that just slows us down and gets us more connected, even in these like momentary ways. But then also an external practice of regular proximity to people who are not operating, whether because of choice or not, on the treadmill, right? Like, and just that, those two things, I think that internal and that external will get us more connected both to the pain of life and to the joy of life, right? And to that abundance that goes in both of those directions. So when you were speaking about that, it's such an interesting pairing you just made between breathing before opening email and going to a soup kitchen or a food bank, right? And yet I think they're really related to this concept of living in a way that honors health and wholeness, that goes beyond, quick fixes or individual self-help methods also.
Yeah, well, and people love to be like, attention, mindfulness, it's the answer. Part of it is not just like, I'm an attentive person and I feel good about myself that way. It's also paying attention to me shows me like more reality. That's the point. And when I am paying attention to how I feel when I'm opening my email, when I'm paying attention to how I feel when I put the phone down and go outside or be bored or make a cake, I'm learning that my perception of what is like productive or what will like raise my amount of status or happiness in the world, and what is like efficient in the literal terms of how I'm spending my time. My perception of that when I'm not paying attention is just not true. Like slowing down, doing fewer things is usually much more efficient. And we all know that person that like answers every email 3 seconds after they get it, and they don't read the original email, and then they've just created more work for everybody, but they feel like they are doing their job really fast and really good. I think we're all in that place a little bit, with a lot of things usually.
Yeah.
And it's the same reality presents itself, spending time, like you said, with people who cannot or will not be on that same treadmill.
Yeah.
The reality opens itself up that first of all, that there is more to life, and second of all, that the way to where we want to go in this like efficient, productive manner, the path just might surprise us.
Yeah. I love that, and I think it might sum up what you've offered here today in a pretty beautiful way, because again, the idea of a path that we are perhaps walking and not, airborne along and traveling super, super fast, but like a slow path of having to notice and maybe taking some wrong turns and maybe having some pain along the way and maybe having some beauty as well. Just seems to really speak to a lot of what you've offered in this book and also in this conversation, as far as a path that might return us to God and to ourselves and to one another, recognizing that there's not a quick fix and there's not an easy solution. There's not a 1, 2, 3. And yet there's also some real hopefulness. Like there's a real sense of even that simplicity of saying, slow down and pay attention, start there. And see what is almost revealed to you, and then take the next step on that path.
Yeah, and we think that we are responsible for so much, but I think that is kind of the core and the essence of our responsibility, actually.
Yeah.
So what is being revealed to you, for you.
Well, Lyndsey, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for your book. Thank you for telling your story. I was really grateful for it, and I'm sure that the listeners here will be as well.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful.
Thanks, as always, for listening to this episode of Love is Stronger Than Fear. And I will remind you, we rely on you to spread the word about this podcast. There are no advertisements. There are no promotions here. There is just word of mouth. And that happens whenever you share it with a friend, or if you give it a rating or a review that does something algorithmically that allows more sharing to happen. Also, I will say, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free. I would love to hear your responses at amyjuliabeckerwriter@gmail.com. I always want to thank Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, Amber Beery for doing everything to make sure that it happens and the show notes are all set and the transcript is up. So thank you to Jake and to Amber, and thank you to you for being here. I do pray and hope as you go into your day today that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.